Welcome to the Rejected Religion podcast. I'm Stephanie Shea. This month's guest is Aaron J. French, an Arizona native and PhD candidate from the University of California, Davis, currently residing in Erfurt, Germany, where he's conducting his dissertation research. Aaron and I met in 2019 at the SWAY 7 conference in Amsterdam. In 2018, Aaron published an article in Correspondences, Journal for the Study of Esotericism, about the Mandela Effect that grew out of a presentation that Aaron gave at the SWAY 6 conference in 2017. In part 1, Aaron and I bring everyone up to speed on what the Mandela Effect is, where it comes from, and why it is an important area of research for the study of esotericism. We discuss examples of the Mandela Effect found with book titles such as Berenstain Bears or Berenstain Bears, pop culture references such as what Darth Vader actually said to Luke Skywalker, how all of this affects our notions of reality and of our memory. We also talk about how Christian elements such as dispensational premillennialism, have come to interact with more esoteric concepts found within the cultic milieu. So jump on our CERN time travel machine and let's explore the dimensions of the Mandela Effect. Welcome to the podcast, Aaron. I'm so happy that you're here to talk with me today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I've enjoyed your podcast. So the opportunity to come and speak is just great.
Thank you so much. I am really looking forward to our conversation today. And that is based upon your article called The Mandela Effect, A New Memory, published in the journal Correspondences from 2018. And this article opens up a wide discussion about conspiracy theories and why people believe in them, the concept of memory and history, how conspiracy theories are intertwined in esoteric thought, and also how Christian ideas are mixed up in conspiracy theories. So due to this very broad scope, I'd like to ask questions of you today that touch upon all of these aspects in our discussion. So in order to delve a little bit deeper into specific examples as well, that can offer a good context for the listeners.
Excellent.
So in order to bring our listeners up to speed on the topic, what is the Mandela Effect? Where did it come from? And how did you come to know about it?
Yeah, so that's a fun question. There's several ways, I guess, you could answer that. There's also not really a great answer in terms of like historically or something.
Okay.
Perhaps that's because it's so new.
Yeah.
Or just because of the nature of it, that it's the whole idea of topics like this is that they take place in a way that's much less regulated than other things that one might study. So it's really hard to kind of track down and figure out sometimes where these things are coming from, right, if like in a specific place. There is a story for it, though. And one of the things that I found so fascinating in revisiting this topic again, because I wrote this paper, I think 2018. So it's been a little while, and I've kept up with the Mandela Effect a little bit, but there have been times where I stopped watching it, but then I would always go back to see, are people still talking about this?
Yeah.
And when I recently looked at it again for this, I saw they are still talking about it. There's an international conference that I sent you the link for.
You did.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
And also many more books have appeared, and there's a movie that came out, and I was asked to write this article for the conversation based on the movie that came out.
Yeah.
So it definitely is still a thing. And so what I found interesting about that is, Carl Jung said about the UFO phenomenon that it was important because it was a way to see mythology being formed sort of in action in his time. That was the way he looked at that. And as I tried to find again the story for where the Mandela Effect came from, that's what I think of, because you can kind of see there is a story. Who knows if it's true or not, but it's then sort of repeated so often, and put together in a sort of larger context again and again, that it starts to create this sort of origin story, whether or not it's even really what exactly happened, but I guess after so many people say it, 10 years later, then it really starts to feel like, okay, that's where it started. And then we just move on with the next part of it.
Yeah.
So the story of where it came from is from this author, a popular paranormal blogger and author who calls herself a paranormal researcher. And her name is Fiona Broome. And she has a website called The Mandela Effect. And the website focuses on alternate memories, alternate realities. And she claims that she launched this website because of a conversation that she had at a science fiction and fantasy conference called Dragon Con.
Okay.
And it was at this conference that she reports having a conversation with someone there. And the discussion came up about whether or not Nelson Mandela was still alive or had died. And she had remembered Nelson Mandela being dead already, because I guess he had just was still alive at the time or had just died recently when this conversation happened. And she even reported to have had memories of watching his funeral on TV, like back in the 90s or something. But then she, of course, how does one check information like that? This is also an important part of this discussion.
Yeah.
You can't go ask people. You have to look on your telephone, on the smartphone. The internet is the oracle that will tell you whether or not this is true. So she looked it up on Google.
Yeah.
And sure enough, the Wikipedia page would say he's still alive. Here's the new dates in her world for when he lived and died. But I guess one of the things we'll get into is, what does one do after that moment? Because you're sort of left with okay, I'm wrong feeling, but you don't feel wrong. You feel like, wait a minute, I think I was right.
Yeah.
So one of her responses to that was to go look for other people who perhaps thought Mandela had died back in the 90s. And apparently there were a lot of them that she found online. And so started this website to explore that particular one first, but then according to her website, and this is, I don't know, there's no way to really substantiate this. I guess someone could have a conversation with her and you can find interviews with her. But according to this story, she then set it up. She coined this term, the Mandela Effect, and then she started compiling other examples, and there sort of started an online conversation about this effect. And it would then moved on from just Mandela to other examples. That's like half of the origin story. There's sort of another half, which we'll probably talk about later, and that has to do with the title of the Berenstain Bears series.
Right.
Sort of happens in another register, but the two converge at a certain point.
Okay.
So, but I'll stick just with the Fiona Broome one for now, because that's where the term itself is supposed to have come from. So when you hear people talking about the Mandela Effect now, like at this conference and people writing books about it, that's usually the story they point to as where the term came from. Although I was reading somewhere recently that if someone does a Google searches terms on Google, that you can find people Googling that term prior to this event. So
prior to the Dragon Con?
Prior to her making this website, and all this kind of thing.
Well, that's interesting.
Yes, that starts the conspiracy right there.
Yeah.
So then for me, how I came across this was, well, I guess I can bring in the other side of it now, because I didn't think Mandela, that was never one of these Mandela effects for me. I never thought that he had died. I didn't have memories like this. When he died, I think it was in 2013, it was like, oh, okay, he passed away. And I didn't have some feeling that he had passed away earlier.
I didn't either.
But when I came across the this other example of the Berenstain Bears book, maybe that's something closer to home that you read as a kid.
I think so. I don't know what
Do you know about?
Yes,
did you
because
know about this?
when I read your article and you said that was the thing that you remembered differently than how it really was, I thought, well, I had the same thing. But
Right. Okay.
I remembered it differently too. So
You remember the other spelling?
yes. Yeah. Strangely enough.
So this was for me back in 2012. And it was a slightly weird thing. And I was not researching conspiracy theory. I was researching esotericism. I was interested. I was getting ready to go back to school and try to do my doctorate and all this. So esotericism, but I was researching. But this really started to bleed more and more into conspiracism by doing this research online. And And it was through that research that I came across this article that I reference in the paper. The blog is called Wood Between Worlds.
Okay.
And it's run by the person who writes on this blog is a person named Reese. And they're also a physicist-y kind of person. I think maybe they work in physics, perhaps, or they were a doctoral student in physics or something like that. I don't know the exact story, but I looked at this blog to see if it was still there, and it is. And there's also a lot on there about science fiction and fantasy. So this is also a major component of this thing, is the science fiction and fantasy community. So that's this kind of, and it starts at this science fiction conference, which was the theme of that conference was alternate realities. So
lots of coincidences going on here.
Right. And this whole idea of fiction is kind of part of this, supernatural and fantasy fiction. But anyway, this blog this particular blog post was titled, "The Berenstain Bears, We Are Living in Our Own Parallel Universe." So I remember reading that and looking at this. I hadn't looked at those books for years, although I'd certainly read them a lot. But when I read his post about it, I did also have this. I remember there was a sort of an affective response, really, to this old spelling versus the new spelling. And so he goes on to. There are a lot of other people. This is a similar thing online who had the same memory, who then congregate around something like this. And he or she, I'm not sure exactly. This person explained this whole thing in terms of physics, and tried to offer a kind of alternative physics as to what to explain this, and namely, it's presented in a way for someone who is knowledgeable of physics, like they're writing from a perspective of a physicist. It's not written in such a way as you would read in like a kind of quantum meditation, quantum new age meditation book or something like that. It's more from a kind of sciencey person. But nevertheless, the conclusion that this person puts forth is that it's possible that there are sort of different dimensions, and that some people are living in one dimension and other people are in another dimension, and that a shift, a memory thing like this around this particular problem of this letter switch is somehow indicative of that, or is a way to interpret or describe this problem. So that just intrigued me, and I thought, well, I do remember it being the other way. And I mean, I'm in science fiction and supernatural fiction already as an editor and a writer, so I then looked more into it, and it just was this sort of endless examples that started to pop up all over the place after that.
I do have the same experience that you talked about in your article about being very confused, because I thought, wait a minute, it was EIN, not AIN, the way it was pronounced. And I think for Americans, the way people pronounce names that are not English, quote unquote, English names, because if you look at it, it looks like a Germanic name,
German Jewish name or something. Yeah.
So you would say Stein instead of Steen or Stain, or however people pronounce. I mean, Americans like to, be very creative with the way they pronounce last names, and not just Germanic names, but also any other type of ethnicity. A lot of I know some people from friends of my family who their name is Shaney, but that's how it's pronounced, but it's spelled Schone.
Yeah.
And how do you get a Shaney out of that? I don't know. Right. Anyway, that's beside the point.
It's funny.
It's so, I think maybe, I was thinking to myself, could it be because of the way people change the pronunciation of particular spellings that would normally be pronounced a different way, and then that's lodged in your brain, and then you think, oh, it must be spelled this way, or it must be spelled that way.
Right.
That's what I was thinking of. But as I kept reading your article about all these other examples, then I started to think, it wasn't that it was like every single one that I thought, oh yeah, I do remember that differently, but a lot of them I did remember differently. Right. So I thought this personally, I mean, I had heard about this this Mandela effect before I had read your article, but when I noticed that your article came up, I was like, I want to read about this because this is kind of my little area of interest too. So, okay, so
your work is also sort of in this world of kind of fantasy culture and science fiction fantasy stuff.
It's kind of located for outsider perspectives, I guess you could say, located in fantasy fiction and those types of environments, but the perception of the people that I'm researching, of course, is not that it is that. It is, of course, very real. And but yes, but I mean, throughout my life, I've always been interested in sci-fi and fantasy. So as a kid, I did read all of the big works. That was kind of my thing. I was an avid reader, so I was, totally caught up in that. So yeah, I think this is super interesting. And then when it seems like this effect has just kind of, as you said, it started with this incident, I guess, if you could say more or less this incident about the death or non-death of Nelson Mandela. But then it kind of snowballed and started to attract all of these other so-called memories that are not the way that we think they are. So yeah, very, very interesting. But then this, of course, this comes down to then what's real, what is reality, and can we trust that we're living in a reality that is the way that we think it is, and how can we trust our memories as well? Can we? Yeah. So raises many questions.
Big question. Yeah, it raises very large existential philosophical questions, sort of very quickly. That's why I liked it too, because there are so many conspiracy theories has become I know conspiracy theory has always been a part of culture, and we will probably talk about that, and you've been talking about it on your show, but it is like the Michael Jackson of culture in the United States now, because it is the biggest thing, it seems like. And there were a lot of those that I follow and think about and have written about, but the Mandela effect one seemed different in a certain way. And that's why I decided to write something more in length on it and kept following it, because it seemed to resist, not totally, but in a certain way to resist some of the political elements, but not totally, which we can talk about. But the other thing is there's really no way to prove or disprove it. And that's kind of interesting in terms of a person's memory. The person either just has to trust their memory or not, but you can't say the person is deluded if they think the memory is right. They can be presented with facts that are contradicted. So it presents a kind of big problem about knowledge is right there,
Right.
But then it goes into other dimensions, and it just becomes very, very wild.
It does, very much so. So we're going to try to get into all these different aspects today. But just for the sake of our discussion right now, you mentioned that you felt that this notion had something to do with esotericism because you were studying that for your PhD. So in your opinion, why is this an important area of research, not only for religious studies in general, but also for the study of esotericism in particular?
Yeah, that's a good question. And as I was thinking about this, I for one thing, the way I was thinking about it at the time in the study of esotericism, the conversation has shifted a little bit, but particularly around 2012, it seemed to me that the study of esotericism did focus largely on this idea of rejected knowledge as a way to define Western esotericism or esotericism. So I think for me, I was looking at what I was interpreting as rejected knowledge. And I was doing that in a very sort of loose way about stuff that you wouldn't find in the New York Times, at least at the time. or in the conversation, although now you will find it in there, or like even mainstream like religious publications, things like this. So for me, this was like a world of rejected knowledge. That's the way I was kind of thinking about it. So I was very interested in how, in this world of rejected knowledge, where you do find all these ideas that are associated with esotericism, you also find these Mandela effects and conspiracy theories I was coming to find.
Right.
But I still think that holds water. I know the conversation about the study of esotericism is sort of in flux at the moment about how do we define this, and is it, shall we call it rejected knowledge, or are we then becoming ourselves conspiracy theorists and thinking about it in this way?
Interesting.
Yeah, Egil Asprem has written an article talking about it in this way. And it's a good point. But anyway, I think in this particular case, we can still start there to think about it. And this is, esotericism is at least sometimes rejected, even though it's still, scientists have gone to seances, and yes, Isaac Newton was into the Kabbalah. This is all very true, but it is still clearly rejected. For example, even in the modern context, I have friends who are alternative healers in California, and this is a story that happened maybe a couple of years ago about having doctors, to try to shut down their practices because they were doing this alternative approach and weren't licensed and credentialed, and therefore shouldn't be able to practice. And so there is definitely a kind of dynamic there that is important. And of course, like religious heresy in a very religious context is another example. So something like the Mandela effect, in my opinion, helps to show that this world of esoteric rejected knowledge, to show not only how it's becoming more widespread and less rejected, but also to show how it incorporates all the stuff we put under esotericism, how something like the Mandela effect constructs itself based on those elements, largely because I think it finds them in this so-called rejective sphere, the cultic milieu, which maybe we'll talk about also. So that was my starting point, and I still think it's true for esotericism that I also want to move along the discussion, and I just kind of talk about esotericism at this point rather than Western esotericism.
That's fine.
But I do know that I still think that that there is still some sort of it's still very productive to think about them in a certain context as forms of knowledge that are either stigmatized or rejected or not authorized. In Egil's a talk that Egil gave, he talked about it in terms of non-prestigious knowledge. That's also maybe a way to kind of think about it.
Yeah, it's definitely can be located in the argument of science taking over the dominant perspective and shutting out any other viewpoints that would contradict that. So in that sense, it is rejected. So, but speaking on terms, there are some important terms that you use in your article that perhaps we could discuss a little bit more, that help to illustrate why esotericism is important in this discussion and in research about conspiracy theories. So you, not to get into a whole lecture about things, but there are three important ones I think that you mention in your article. The first one is cultic milieu. The second one is rejected knowledge, and we've touched a little bit on both of those. And the third one is stigmatized knowledge. Now, I've talked a little bit about the cultic milieu, but I think you, the way you describe it in your article, it goes into a little bit of different areas that I haven't touched on. So if you could kind of place these terms within this milieu.
Sure. Yeah. The rejected knowledge one, we could sort of put that as as esotericism. One, stigmatized knowledge is this term developed by Barkun, whose book I think you have read, and it is also talking about things like magic and esotericism, but he's also talking about conspiracy theory. So he uses this term, and I have a definition here. One of the ways he has defined it: that knowledge claims that have failed to meet the tests or standards of universities, the scientific community, government, and similar organizations to which people look for judgments of approval.
Right.
So stigmatized knowledge is, as Egil called it, non-prestigious That's one way to think about it. Another way would be sort of non-authorized. That's kind of the way I would want to talk about it, that it's knowledge that's not been authorized by legitimating and credentialing institutions and organizations within whatever context you happen to find yourself.
Right.
Yeah, and then the cultic milieu is a sociological term that I think was developed in the 1970s to try to kind of account for the underground scene in a certain sense. And the way I always think about the cultic milieu is like occulture. Is sort of
and that's where it came from. The term occulture came from this whole concept.
Right, so, exactly.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of theorized as a place of non-Christian underground fringe, in quotes, elements where they all sort of were collected because they'd been rejected or stigmatized or whatever for a variety of social reasons. So that whole realm it's changing now as I talk about in my paper, but that whole realm was considered in terms of, for sociologists at least, in terms of something like the cultic milieu.
Yeah, this loosely networked group of people who were the quote-unquote seekers of this alternate type of information, knowledge, viewpoints, however you want to fill in the blank there.
Right.
So that's very, very broad, and that includes many, many different areas, of course. And it includes the UFOs, it includes alternative healing, it includes anything, basically. Anything that is other, quote unquote, other. Right. It's kind of all lumped into this area. So, okay, so we have a kind of a framework now that we've set for what it is that we're talking about.
Right, and maybe one thing I could just add is why I used this term, the cultic milieu. It was to try to place the emergence of the Mandela effect within that community or within that area. And I have problems with thinking about that term, but I don't think it's necessarily useful. And I tried to show how it was kind of breaking down, but I still think that there is a way I do think that the Mandela effect emerged in a kind of underground space. Well, it did, So I was calling that the cultic milieu.
Yeah, definitely a space where ideas that may not be considered mainstream ideas, or as you said, ideas that are not traditional ideas, et cetera, are not authoritative types of ideas where, that's very, very open-minded people, very, open to new thoughts, new ideas. So, okay. So let's delve a little bit deeper into some examples of the Mandela effect. And I'm just going to call it ME from now on because I think that might be easier.
It's better, yeah.
And how this affects our notions of reality. You note in your article that there are basically two interrelated camps among people who research ME, and that they both believe that CERN and D-wave system quantum computers are thought to be altering reality, resulting in the past being, quote unquote, edited. So when I read this part of your article, I'm making a lot of links with hyperstition and the mauve zone and all of these types of things that I've been learning about recently, about how when you're thinking about this quantum computer, that it's actually binary, but it can be simultaneous. You can have ones and zeros existing independently of each other, but they could be existing simultaneously. That made me think of this whole mauve zone of waking and dreaming simultaneously type of thing that you get from occult information, and this being, Kenneth Grant and these types of magic, et cetera.
Right.
Also with the Ifa religion, that this has something to do with. This is more of a. I'm not really super well versed in the Ifa religion, but it's an African religion that has some type of ties to Vodun, but it's kind of a system of divination that also uses these ideas of, like they use a type of shell, and if the shell has the open side, then it means something, and if it has the smooth side, then it means something else. So, and they base their divination on these types of. It's the kind of the 0 and the 1. So, right. I'm kind of, my mind is just kind of going everywhere, but I think you do a good job of talking about how this past is edited. So I'd like you to elaborate on how this is alleged to happen and how it manifests.
That's really interesting, actually, the way you say that. There's a lot to think about that. I do think one of the results of this is a sort of breakdown. Well, I think it's both an attempted reinforcement of binary thinking through the way the computer works, computer algorithms, these rational algorithms working on binary logic. So in a certain sense, I think the computer itself, the internet, the way we're using it, this in its current iteration reinforces binary positions. But I think something like the Mandela effect perhaps could be thought about in terms of a response to the breakdown of that, is culturally speaking at the same time. So it's like maybe a weird tension there. And the quantum computer, the idea of using a quantum computer is itself the idea of going beyond those binary positions to be able to hold kind of superpositions or something. So that there's a lot there as well. I guess one thing I maybe would say first, just to give a couple examples of this for people who haven't heard of it. So we brought up the one about this Berenstain Bears title.
Yeah.
And I have a funny story about that maybe I'll come back to when we get to these questions about race and everything that I found recently. But that one and the Mandela effect are sort of two of the earliest ones. But there's a lot, actually. And a lot of them don't. I mean, for me, for various people, they resonate differently, whether or not you think that this isn't a change or if it was always that way. But there are sort of like 10 to 25, maybe like major ones that keep getting used. And one is like sometimes it can be a lot of things. Also, sometimes it can be a line from a movie. And it's a lot, frequently pop culture references, which is also striking. So one of these is the line from the famous line from Star Wars.
I knew you were going to use that one.
Yeah. That is where Darth Vader says to Luke, "Luke, I am your father." This sort of revealing moment at the end. That's the way people remembered him saying it. But when you go watch the movie, Darth Vader doesn't say his name, Luke. He just says, "No, I am your father."
Right.
Another one is in the Forrest Gump movie, where there's, and sometimes it's really slight changes, like in this example, where people remember the famous line being what is it? Life is like a box of chocolates. But if you go listen to the movie, the actual line is life was like a box of chocolates. And just one more here is this Field of Dreams movie. And the Field of Dreams, there is the memory, the people who have the experience the Mandela effect remember the line being in the famous line in this movie, "If you build it, they will come." Mm-hmm. If you go listen to the movie, it does not say that. It says, "If you build it, he will come."
Yeah.
So there's a few.
All three
examples.
of those I misremembered. I thought it was Luke, I am your father. I thought it was Luke. I didn't. And
So did I.
I thought life is like, I thought it was like a simile, life is like a box of, and I thought it was, if you build it, they will come. Because I think it has to do with the fact that more than one person came.
Right.
And I think that's how I'm thinking. So, but yeah, all the other ones that you mentioned about mirror, mirror on the wall, that it's not mirror, mirror, it's magic mirror. And then you go back and watch it and you're like, how did I miss that? How am I not remembering this?
And it's interesting because I think it is significant that lots of people have this misremembering, so-called misremembering.
Yeah.
Now, there is like a debunking element in this where people go to try to look at why is it being misremembered, and can sometimes bring evidence forward to say this is why you're misremembering it. So, for instance, in the Forrest Gump film, the line "Life is like a box of chocolates" does appear in the film, but it's his mother says it to him. But then when he says it himself, he says life was like a box of chocolates. So it's potentially that there's some kind of confusion happening there.
Right.
And like if you search for "if you build it, they will come" on the internet, you will find lots of memes that people made with that famous line. So who knows? There's also a repetition quality.
Exactly. With the memes, with the Jaws line. You're going to need a bigger boat.
Right. Or it's we're going to need a bigger boat.
Yeah.
Right.
Or the other way around. Now I can't even remember how the what is supposed to be the quote unquote right one. I'm so confused.
Exactly. Well, just to bring in a few more of these so it happens in pop culture film references. It also happens in titles to movies and shows. So we'll just to give one example is the remembered title for the show, Sex in the City. That's the way these people remember it being called, Sex in the City, but the show is actually called Sex and the City. And there's a couple other examples like that. There's also lots of logos that have changed, and interesting ones to look at are like the Ford logo. If you look at the Ford logo, the F has this little curlicue on the second rung, and the Mandela Effect people talk about not remembering this little curlicue ever being there. And another one is the VW sign for Volkswagen, that there's this line cutting between the V and the W that they also don't remember. And the Volvo sign they remember just being a circle, but now it's a circle. Now it's like the astrological Mars sign. It's a circle with the little... So those are interesting, but it goes beyond that. And this is where I started to get really interested in this, is that it also goes into geographical and bodily changes. So the geographical changes that are sometimes remarked on is something like, we're looking at a map, a Google Maps usually, because Google the one who tells us all this. In Google Maps, the Australia looks much closer to the mainland continents than people remember it. They used to remember it being much farther away, but now it's much closer. Another funny one is if you look at North and South America, people remember them being that South America is directly underneath North America, but actually it's way over by Greenland, underneath Greenland. And one comment on that I wanted to say that I found interesting is when a person thinks that their whole life, let's say that South America is directly beneath North America, then they look at a map and it's not. And it's way over underneath Greenland. The response is either to say, well, I guess I was wrong my whole life. I must have looked at every single map wrong my whole life. But, or you could say, no, something's wrong about this particular map, and then to kind of go look at a bunch of other maps. But then you will find that all these other maps show this too. And then you're in this sort of fog, psychic fog of like, what the hell is going on? But I had one guy, I noticed, I've watched this a lot because I'm aware of all this in society. I was at a talk one time where a guy was giving a lecture, and just randomly, he started talking about something about South America. And he said, and he was an older gentleman, and it had nothing to do with his talk, but he was saying, by the way, you might have always thought that South America was right below North America, but it's actually not. I always thought that, but it turns out I had it wrong. It's actually beneath Greenland, so make sure you don't make that mistake. And what I had realized, and he just went on talking with a totally other subject, what I had realized is that he had somehow had a Mandela Effect moment, but he didn't know anything about the Mandela Effect. He had interpreted finding it as him somehow being wrong about it the whole time. And then he just thought, I guess I was wrong.
I see, yeah. So there was no validation of your... what would you call that? Your insistence that you were right. There's no other people validating that for you. Okay.
Right. No other context in which to interpret it. But it's still very significant that he had the same feeling. Like you can't just, in my opinion, okay, maybe people do misremember things, but at the same time, I think there's still something going on with that I don't exactly know what it is, but it is strange that he and all these other people had this experience. He didn't have a framework in which to put it, but he still had the experience. And one of the things that these Mandela Effect people love to do is torture their family members with this stuff. So they go around testing all of their family members these questions like, hey, do you remember this line? What was it? Do you remember where's South America? And these family members frequently get it all wrong. And then they get to say, it's actually here. And then they start telling them about the Mandela Effect. So there's like this, this.
Do they then go into the whole idea about alternate realities and we're living in a new reality because it's different from how you remember it?
Right. Okay. Yep. Usually these people, that's most people interpret it that way. There are a lot of different groups, which we'll get into in a second.
Yeah.
Also, but one last place where this gets really interesting is, so then you have the geographical changes. There's also changes in the body. People remember the heart being on the left side of the body, and they remember this. Usually they say that's where you put your hand on your heart when you say the Pledge of Allegiance or something. But the heart is actually in the center, right here. It's not on the left side of the body. And they say that the stomach, they remember being down in the stomach, but it's actually up here. And the intestines are down there. And various other sizes of the liver being the wrong size. From there's lots of what they call mandanimals. Let's see. I think that's what they call it. Manned animals. These are new species of animals that have appeared on the Earth because of the Mandela Effect.
Oh.
So you can find, so you can look that up if you like. And it's endless pictures of really strange looking animals that I had never heard of in various parts of the world that look very interesting. And sometimes, frequently, there's sort of hybrid, like what is the one that there's this hummingbird moth, which is a mix between a moth and a hummingbird. So they have examples like that I have never seen a hummingbird moth, but okay, apparently there's hummingbird moths, which are giant moths that are part hummingbird or something. I don't know the exact.
Well, this is interesting, though. So they don't, these people who adhere to this idea, they don't think that there could just be a possibility that there could be species that we just haven't discovered yet, and that it's just, that happens all the time with deep sea animals. Because of the fact that we can't go to the deep sea. Mm-hmm. At a certain point, we have to stop because it's harmful to us. We can't deal with that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't life forms that are down there, and we find out that there are. So I don't see that as, I don't know, maybe I'm being very stubborn and obstinate about it, but I don't see how you can think that those animals didn't exist before. That it has to do with a shift or an alternate reality or something like that. I guess I'm just not totally committed to this idea. I have too much resistance against it, I guess. So,
well, it could be a kind of like, this is they're sort of self-fulfilling bias. They're
right.
They already have the framework of the Mandela Effect, so. There is, and I don't have a position on this, honestly, but there is an interesting problem here about ignorance versus knowledge versus also memory and facts. Mm-hmm. So, that's the real problem there. And when a person is wrong, how do you show them that they're wrong? And what is their response to it? But at the same time, I don't think that there's just a bunch of people who don't know the facts, and then when they're showed the facts, they're resisting them. I think that's definitely going on. Mm-hmm. And I think one example, because I'm an editor, is I know all about typos. And so they find a lot of time they're clearly typos in magazines that prove to them that it was spelled the other way, some product or something. And in my mind, as an editor, I'm like, I think he screwed that up. He hit the wrong key.
Right.
Happens all the time, actually. It's not like some source of definite knowledge. This newspaper from 1910, Right. But so part of it's self-validating, I suppose. But I do also think they're hitting on something that is happening that I'm still trying to make sense of in terms of cultural shifts and reactions to technology and reactions to paradigm. I think is also paradigm breakdown is another thing.
Yeah, and exactly the confirmation bias that you mentioned. That's a difficult one.
Right.
To
we all struggle with that.
Yes, I think we all do. Okay, so getting back to these two camps that you mentioned in your article, regarding the second one, you interestingly note in your article, quote, how Christian elements have come to cohabitate in the cultic milieu with both esotericism and New Age spirituality, end quote.
Right.
So what differentiates them from the first group is that they use references taken from the Bible, referring to the prophecy of the quote-unquote end times, the apocalypse, the Antichrist, and satanic influences and signs. Yeah. So this seems to be alluding to what's known as dispensational premillennialism, and that's the idea that the Antichrist will appear on Earth in what... don't know who, if it's male, female, but they will appear on Earth. Yeah. And then a rapture of born again believers will occur. And then a time of tribulation will last until the second coming of Christ, after which there will be 1,000-year peaceful reign ending with the last judgment. And that's what this whole Left Behind series is getting at. If people... thinking of pop culture references. And I remember this growing up in the United States in a evangelical environment. This was kind of the big thing that was talked about a lot. So, that's what the millennialism is kind of about. Right. There are different forms of it, but this is the one that's most fresh in my mind, because that's what I experienced myself, I guess. So, but Michael Barkun, who you referenced, who wrote A Culture of Conspiracy, places millennialism in the area of conspiracy. So this is kind of what we're talking about here. So how does ME in particular affect or play out with regard to this type of thinking? And do these people really think that the past has been changed? Or that the future will be changed because of stuff that's being changed in the past, or does it change what's written in the Bible, etc.?
Yeah, no, that's a good problem that the conversation taking place is sort of around all that. If you go and watch or read things from these Mandela Effect researchers, as I call them. Before I go to that, one last comment I wanted to make, just to show how all-encompassing this whole thing is for these people.
Sure.
That after the new animals, it's then historical events that they find in history that they don't remember being there. And history starts to become remembered in a different way. That also goes to anecdotal evidence, and you find lots of this, of people seeing trees that are colors they've never seen before, seeing a building that they knew was there last week is suddenly gone, or a tree they knew was there was gone. Sort of like Sartre, now that I say this, why is that tree there? Why is it not there? There's this existential moment that they're actually having. So it does take the person, it can take the person right to the brink of this existential crisis, with things sort of, and even one weirder comment is people interviewing members of their family or talking to them, and they're not acting differently than they remember, or having different memories than they have about things in the past. So anyway, it becomes an all-encompassing thing a lot of the time. It isn't just about a movie quote. It's a total sort of paradigm shift.
Yes.
Yeah. So people who are, and there's varying degrees of that. There is a kind of pop culture who just are into it for, I don't know, they do find it interesting, but they can make a YouTube video. And these YouTube videos get millions of views now, which is also amazing. And they talk about Mandela effects. They don't necessarily perhaps maybe go down this Sartre rabbit hole, but some do. So in that conversation, what I tried to do in the paper was break it into groups. It sort of works. It kind of doesn't, to be honest, especially now. But at the time, I was trying to put my eyes on different people interested in this. And so I tried to have, and there still is people who interpret this differently. There's one group who would maybe want to interpret this all in terms of physics. changes a sort of kind of like it does have an element of spirituality, but it doesn't have to, but kind of like the magic of science, the magic of something like CERN, the magic of computers and what we can do with them, this sort of technological euphoria, perhaps enchantment of technology, that with our technology and a knowledge of quantum mechanics and this sort of thing, that we have somehow managed to disrupt consensus reality or disrupt the classical physics of reality, and that's what people are experiencing, that there's some kind of a physics scientific explanation for this, which is still wild in terms of a science fiction-y scenario. And that's sort of what it's like. It's like a hard sci-fi scenario or something. And CERN is sometimes commented on there, but another thing that's frequently pointed out in that group is the idea of time travel. And so sometimes you'll find discussions about the probability of being able to construct devices that could travel through time, and that potentially this has been done, and that having done that is what's shifting these timelines, they call them, or shifting reality in these ways.
It's funny how not funny, haha, but just very interesting how concepts that are taken from science fiction are, it seems to, like the story about Star Trek and their little flip devices that they communicated with each other, and that turned into our phones, our cell phones and things like that. How these ideas have so developed and become more of scientific discussion. Interesting how you bring up as well about the magic of science, because when you get into all of these more advanced theories of science that, and I'm not a scientist in this regard, but I do recall some type of effect that you have to observe something for it to be there, like particles, things like that. That's, and so it doesn't seem that far of a stretch if you accept these types of scientific theories. It doesn't seem to be that far of a stretch to think, well, yeah, we could time travel. Theoretically,
Right.
So
and science fiction is supposed to be like putting taking those ideas and then imagining something with them in like a future. That's kind of how science fiction started.
These new ideas about things that aren't in our existence, in our sense of reality, in our world, physical world, then in the future end up being there because of these ideas of people. So all of these things that are seemingly not real are actually real in the end.
Or will be real.
Or will be real, yeah. So anyway.
Yeah, I guess that actually touches on, the paper is called Future Memory. So at the end of the paper, I do start to talk about how could we have memories of the future? And perhaps we'll get to that.
Yes, I would like to get to that. But I think we got off on a little tangent about the...
so those were the sciencey
with regard
people.
to the religious people and how they think things are changing or not changing.
Right, because on the other side of that, and there's this is very like Max Weber ideal type logic that I'm using here, because this stuff is it's really more intermixed, and that is the point I make by the end of the paper. But you could have people that interpret it more in this scientific way, and there are a number of those who would do it this way. Then you have the spiritual way, the sort of outright spiritual interpretation of it. The physics people, the physics interpretation might allow for that consciousness, but it's not going to go into the Antichrist is here, or something like that. It's going to keep that concept away. To say one more thing about this physicist, more sciencey interpretation, you will find in there these conspiracy elements as well, that it's more of a skeptical, non-spiritual, that the kind of authoritarian, anti-government interpretation, that this is actually a kind of government op to destabilize the population. Right, so that sometimes goes over there. Of course, that interpretation can get a spiritual layer, which it does sometimes.
It's like all interwoven, and it can be at points anyway. So, okay.
Yeah, but I still tried to break them up just to think about them. So we can put
Sure.
the physicist interpretation in the one box, and then the other box, we can put the spiritual interpretation. And there is even a split in that box, but the two overlap. And one is like a New Age, it's what we could call New Age interpretation. And the other one is this dispensationalism, this more fundamentalist rapture scenario. And those people are interested. The New Age people, for the most part, just accept it, as far as I can tell. But there is a split in the Christian interpretation between whether or not we should accept the fact, for one of the another examples for why the Christians are interested in this too is because a lot of these Mandela effects are also changes to the Bible. And
right.
I think the first one of these changes was in the passage in Isaiah where everyone remembers it as the wolf, the lion will lay down with the lamb or something, but it actually says the wolf, but it does say the lamb 3 lions down or something like that. So the original thing that people remember is there, but it's not in the same way. And it's the first line that puts the wolf there. And another one is like, people remember this phrase of Jesus saying, pick up thy bed and walk. But if you go read it, he says, pick up thy couch and walk. And these people say like, well, there was no couches in that time. Like, what is this? An interesting thing about watching that discussion is that sometimes has to do with translations being changed. And there's a whole discourse around these evil academics retranslating the Bible, that you can find that there sometimes.
Okay.
But it isn't just that, because like with the wolf one, the lamb will lay and the lion will lay down together. Now that it says wolf, the people who doubted this would go get they have videos they put online of go get their grandmother's Bible from 18 something, or great grandmother's, and then to check, has it been changed? Has it been retranslated or something? It hasn't. The original is there in the physical copy too. So
the wolf is there and it's not lion? As
right, the lion's
remember?
several lines down. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So it's in this instance, it is a memory issue. It's not a translation issue. Okay.
Right. And they will find what they call, all the groups do this, look for residue. And residue is places where you find either people talking in the past or written in the past of the way you remember it. And they can always find it. That's another thing. So you can find lots of movies where the people quote the line exactly as it's not, about the lion and the lion.
Yes, that video that you sent me today about the fellow talking about Houston, we have a problem. And he goes to the film, Tom Hanks saying, Houston, we have a problem. And that's apparently not what was actually said. So, so Tom Hanks is a part of this whole conspiracy.
Well, yeah, because
I'm just joking.
Well, that's a whole other element where they have to there's this concept of flip-flopping, because they have had experiences where it changes and then it's suddenly the way they remember it again. And they say that this is a part of this reality shifting, that their timelines are kind of flipping back and forth. And the example I gave you was this tidy cat thing. Where, I don't know if I'm not invested in that one per se. I had cats for sure, but people remembered it being tidy cats with an S. And there was a moment, and this is in around 2016 or 2017, where there was all these videos, Mandela Effect people. This is when I was researching it, saying it's not tidy cats, it's just tidy cat with no S. But then about several months later, it changed back. And then people were uploading videos saying, now I was just in the store and it said tidy cat, but now even the one in my closet or something has the S again. So they call this phenomenon
the flip-flopping. So how is this explained?
The timeline. Well, if you notice with the guy I sent you, they're a little freaked out.
Yeah,
about all this.
They're definitely freaked out.
Yeah, it's not, there is explanation, there's theorizing happening, but I don't think anyone, other than the Christians that we can get to, usually, the physicists perhaps, but they're also sort of speculating. But no one really has a good answer.
Okay, so the science-y explanation would be like, okay, we're just flipping back and forth through time.
Yeah, it is scientifically possible to have these overlapping dimensions.
Or however you want to call it. And then the religious explanation would be more of, see, this is a sign that the Antichrist is here?
Right, yeah, but there's a split in that, because the way that and I have a video that I gave in my presentation in here in Erfurt, actually, at the original the ESWI conference here, my first one. That's why it was the original for me, but there had been other ones. But at that conference, with that, the reason why the biblical one is interesting is because if the Bible has been changed, the reason why a Christian would get interested in the Mandela effect, these sorts of Christians, what I would refer to as biblical prophecy. This is sort of what we're talking about. The fulfillment of biblical prophecy, the days of Noah returning, something like that is what it says. So if you remember a passage in the Bible being a certain way, and then you hear this Mandela effect thing, and it's different, that is then an issue of the Bible, the text itself, which is a sacred text, which is considered to be the Word of God. So if you assume that the Bible has been altered in some way, the only person in this context, it's the adversary, Satan, the Antichrist, would be the one altering it. But this would sort of show they somehow are more powerful than God's Word.
Yeah. Then there wouldn't be a literal truth anymore of the Bible.
Right. It would be somehow the Word of God has been distorted. So there are a lot of Christians who are sure that it was this other way. And the video I showed here in Erfurt was a preacher guy talking to his congregation, and he was also very upset, and he was sort of crying, and he remembered that they were these various passages, which we won't go through, were the other way. His whole life, he remembered them, and now they're different. And this was scared him, and he sort of told his congregation, trust your memory. We have to in this time, kind of a thing, is, because we're being attacked by, and the way it is thought about is, yes, the end times are here, the Antichrist is coming. There's a line in the book of Revelations that says the Antichrist will alter times and seasons, something like that. So they sometimes interpret it through this. But then you had a reaction to that from preachers who were like, wait a minute, this is the Word of God. It can't be changed. It was not changed. If you say it has been changed, then you're suddenly demoting God to like a status lower down or something. So there's a lot of preachers also putting videos out debunking the Mandela effect for this problem. So that's the religious world, but it is all interpreted through this biblical prophecy with an overlay of the science. But the science in this case is evil science. It's not, how magic science could be. It's like they're doing evil things. They're trying to recreate the creation of the galaxy at CERN.
So there's definitely a different perspective and a different feeling about it for the people who are just kind of think it's fun to go through pop culture references. That's one thing, but for these people, this is like life and death. This is spiritual warfare. This is serious, and this is not a laughing matter.
Right, and so in between all of that, which is more on the spiritual side, but it's sort of in between both, is this New Age. I would call New Age, which has much more of the esotericist elements in it, although they all incorporate some of it. And the New Age idea is also about consciousness evolving. The new consciousness is here, in which we'll all be clairvoyant and psychic, sort of reconnecting with Mother Earth, the spirit of the earth, perhaps. And a lot of times, as I wrote in my article, this 2012 was this, in the New Age community, was this moment where there's supposed to be this paradigm shift in consciousness, but nothing kind of happened. But now people look at this Mandela effect thing sometimes as, maybe something is changing.
Okay. I see.
Yeah, and it's more like a kind of a spiritual awakening, I guess is how I put that. And we'll talk about this too. That can also be taken in various directions.
I see. But in this regard, it's seen more as a benevolent type of change. It's for the betterment of humanity.
I would say so. It is not always. And again, they all overlap to a certain extent around the idea of CERN. Like, none of them think CERN is a good thing, I don't think. Well, the physicist people would. The physicist people would not have a negative view of CERN. They would say, perhaps, though, something CERN did this or something. But both the New Age and the more religious would view the science behind the science part of it as being somehow threat to kind of human flourishing or human spiritual flourishing, something like that, or in the biblical case, strictly in this biblical prophecy mode.
Right. So the quote unquote powers that be behind CERN are the ones that are the evil players in the game. Yeah. Okay.
Evil string pullers or something.
Yeah, right. The puppet masters for everyone. Okay. Please check out the program notes and my social media platforms for more links to videos and blogs mentioned in Part 1. In Part 2, Aaron and I continue our conversation by looking at more esoteric examples of the Mandela Effect. Our good pals, the Discordians, make another appearance as we talk more about conspiracy theories, and we also delve a bit deeper into the whole memory issue that's connected to the Mandela Effect. I hope you'll join us.